Thank you for joining us again on another Rebuilding the Black Family. This is a great episode, a great program we have for you today. Thanks for joining us. You know, one of the things I've had to learn was to listen, to appreciate, to learn from the experiences of other people. And some of that meant learning from negative experiences that I maybe didn't like or was uncomfortable. It meant not dismissing individuals or people that I didn't want to hear or like hearing. And so we've got a good program here today. That's going to maybe touch on some of that today, David. And so we're going to tune into that. So, David, just take it away.
You know, that's a nice, introduction into what we're going to be speaking about today, Carl. In that we're speaking about the true colors, as I would say, of the pandemic. I want to say that again, the true colors of the pandemic. And there's a bit of a double entendre there, and people will see what I mean. But I think what we could do to start off, I want to start off with that article that you had been telling me about, that I think would be a nice segue into our conversation today.
Thank you. So in late 2020, so November and the first part of December, in the height of the pandemic, there was an headline I read, and I believe it would be familiar to many of our viewers. And it chronicled, or it outlined, it said this: Black doctor dies of COVID-19 after complaining of racist treatment. And it was a doctor in Indiana.
Black doctor.
A black doctor. And the quote says, "He made me feel like a drug addict." Dr. Susan Moore said, accusing a white doctor of downplaying her complaints of pain and suggesting she should be discharged. And further on down, just part of the article, not the entire one. After Dr. Moore, 52, complained about her treatment, she received care that she said adequately treated her pain. She was eventually sent home, and on Sunday, just more than 2 weeks after posting the video, Dr. Moore died of complications from COVID-19, said her son, Henry Muhammad. And so there's a conclusion, of the article is the unfortunate thing that it's not an uncommon experience. And so why this is important, it's part of my self-admission that I had to learn that just because something wasn't my experience didn't make another person's experience invalid or any less real. But can you imagine, David, and then we'll continue, you can speak to this. Can you imagine this is a medical doctor? Medical doctor in Indiana.
Done a residency and everything.
Going into, she now needs treatment from COVID-19.
Of course.
And knows usually maybe what the protocols are, what should be, what you do before you send someone home, if you do send them home. And can you imagine, because she actually posted videos of her treatment and actually chronicled her treatment. But I'm sure she wasn't planning on dying.
No.
Do you see what I'm saying? And so part of why this was brought out was the fact that she was a doctor.
Yes.
But it also showed the disparity of treatment.
The racial
across
disparity.
colors, exactly. And so let's pick up on that today. When you talked about the title of today's program, the episode is The True Colors of the Pandemic.
Very good. I have to say, with this pandemic, with this virus, the COVID-19 virus, it's now, 2022. And I guess one could say we've either come out of it or we're slowly coming out of it. But up until this point, I have to say it was confusing as to what we as Black people, where our stance was when it came to this virus, right? Black doctor or Black frontline worker or a Black person on welfare, whomever, Black person in general across the spectrum. It was very confusing because when you hear, stories like this, where this Black doctor died of COVID-19 complications, it validates the data that demonstrates that Black people are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. But on the flip side, and you have some black people, both in the States as well as in Canada, as well as in the UK, throughout the Western Hemisphere, and even some arguably in the Caribbean, for instance, and in Africa, who would look at that situation and think, well, that's a one-off. Because, well, we as black people, we aren't affected by COVID. I mean, I don't know if you remember, there was this idea that that at least was brought to my attention that, exactly. And the first part of it was, oh no, black people can't get that a virus because, for one, people thought it was more so a Chinese virus, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, right? Because it came out of China. Then people thought it was a white or European virus. People thought black people were immune to it. So then you have people who have that school of thought who would look at this story and would think, oh well, she's an exception to the rule because, well, they would think this COVID-19 phenomenon is a hoax. So this is the challenge with the pandemic, and I call it the true colors of the pandemic because I think it created extreme polarization in our community, not only in our society, but if we focus on our community, it created extreme polarization, and it all maintains the divide and conquer tactic of European racism. This is why I call it the true colors of the pandemic, because what came out of it was not essentially really much that was productive for our advancement. A lot of it was just maintained division. And so when I hear this story, I just think about how it could be taken in so many different ways. And of course, it would take away from the fact that this was a woman who was in the medical profession in the US, who was mistreated, and we can say arguably because of the color of her skin, because I've never heard of stories like this from white physicians. And how this maintains this notion that as black people, no matter what your socioeconomic status is, no matter what your educational level is, you are more at risk of being mistreated, even with an illness like COVID, than any other group. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's my initial thoughts,
yeah.
at least.
And in building on that whole, let's say, well, we can still continue along that line.
Of course.
The pandemic, we could say, when something like that happened, an extreme, whether it's a pandemic or something that really affects society at large.
Yeah.
It oftentimes reveals on a greater scale what's already there.
It magnifies it.
So it magnifies the
Very
system.
good.
It magnifies the weaknesses.
Very good.
And so, for example, if we check North America, but particularly the United States, the number's about 1 million people died of COVID, up to this date. But who was the main casualty? It was frontline people, which were black people.
Yeah.
Now think about this then.
And the same thing in Canada.
Yes, same thing.
Yeah.
So what we're saying is, remember, if black people are the main service people.
Yes.
So they're servicing, whether it's hotels,
PSW
grocery
workers, nurses, etc.
So they're people with the frontline people.
Yes.
So they're the ones then who are more likely to contract it because of their interaction with people constantly.
Yes.
So now where many people had the opportunity to work from home.
Yes. I was about to say, yeah.
So what I'm saying, it revealed the system.
Yes.
It revealed the weaknesses of the system.
Yes.
It revealed also the lack of opportunity.
Yes.
For some people to kind of step out of certain arenas.
And even in that, black people are also more likely to live in marginalized neighborhoods that are economically destitute, that are food insecure, and that are have situations of overcrowding, whether it's in townhomes, whether it's in apartment buildings. So you add in now us being predominantly the frontline workers, us being in precarious employment, because even in the frontline workers, if you have full-time permanent, you get sick days.
Exactly.
But if you don't, you work temporary contracts, if you work in more than one, let's say nursing home, my wife's a nurse, so she had many of her friends who had these experiences where you had to quit one of your jobs because they were trying to reduce the amount of transference of the disease, which I get it, but at the same time, well, you have to have an alternative for our people in Ontario, in Montreal, or I should say in Quebec and whatever respective province in Canada or throughout the States. When you have all of that playing out, as well as the environmental factors, that makes black people even more prone or at higher risk, more susceptible to contracting the virus, right? So I guess why I get now on one side, and this I think is a nice transition. I hope this is with the direction you're going. Why you have certain groups, like for instance, the Black Scientists Task Force in Ontario.
I'm aware of that.
I'm not sure if they have like an equal one in Montreal or in Edmonton, for instance, other more cities with large black populations. I see why they came about, because they're looking at this side of the coin and saying, well, black people are more susceptible because of these respective factors.
Exactly.
So it makes sense. I say, okay. But then on the flip side, I also get why people are saying, well, we're also hesitant about anything coming from the government because of a history of being lied to, of being mistreated, of having, when it comes to medical treatment, either it being withheld or it being provided, but not in the way that's going to fully get you to recover, or is going to even create further harm to you. So I also get why there's the vaccine hesitancy. So you see what I'm saying? So even in that, I get why, even if we're the frontline workers, why there's still people who are hesitant, who are go down in their grave and say, I'm not taking that vaccine because of the historical consequences that have, as we've talked about in previous episodes, have not been recognized nor remedied or reconciled.
And then we go back to, let's say, again, and this is where when I started out by saying we need to, I learned personally to appreciate and learn from
Yes.
things I didn't want to hear,
Yes.
things I might not have agreed with, but realizing, no, as I listened to that person, I learned some things.
Yeah.
So, for example, you talked about, let's say, the hesitancy. You know, we're aware of, in America, the Tuskegee experiments.
Yeah.
We're aware of different experiments done on black people.
Yep.
So people who go way back,
Yeah.
you know, it's when I lived in, for example, when I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the South was more prosperous than North Tulsa.
Yeah.
But when you spoke to people in North Tulsa, they had a history of the civil rights and before civil rights. Think about this.
Yeah.
So some of them knew they had relatives who were enslaved.
Yes.
We're talking, so they know that history.
Yes.
They were more hesitant to relate to people who
Yeah.
were white. Some of them were still, they would never trust a white person
Yep. And
Now,
they're
now think about that now.
And they're justified in it.
because of what they actually experienced. They
Exactly.
saw someone die. Think about this.
Exactly.
They saw a lynching. You see what
Yep,
I'm saying?
yep.
So they saw that. And so, you know, I didn't know what they were talking about because
Yep.
I never saw that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep,
So,
yep.
so similarly, going fast forward here. So you mentioned something about, let's say, the hesitancy. That's what
Yeah.
we're talking about, the true colors of the pandemic.
Yep.
It really did reveal that because, let's say, and you said it right, where I had people spoke to me, reached out to me, and actually
Yeah.
said, Carl, if I take, and this is what
Yep.
a personal experience. I'm
Yep,
not talking
yep,
about
yep,
hearsay.
Yep.
Call it more than a couple of people said, but if I take that, it's going to damage my body.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about someone who was laughing.
No.
We're talking
There's someone who's
someone
serious.
very serious.
Very good.
I don't want to do this. I had another person say, if I do this, don't you know, they want to change the DNA in your body.
Yes.
So now this
Yeah.
is someone people actually
Yeah.
believe in this.
And to be clear, these, and I'm going to presume that these are people that are of various education
Very,
levels,
yes.
right? With
Very.
PhDs, or as
Yep.
I call it, penitentiary
Young
degrees,
and old.
right? Young and old. So this is not a respective demographic, because people often, again, in part of their classes sort of mentality, do think, well, that's strictly the working class with their conspiracy theories. Oh, they kind of rule them out, right? Or overlook what they're saying. But I'm presuming, at least, and I can see it from personally, people of all education levels, I've seen people with the highest levels of education who refuse to take that vaccine. To this day, they say, nope, I am not taking that vaccine because I do not believe that COVID is as severe as people are making it out to be. I believe it is a hoax. I believe the vaccine is going to change my DNA. It's going to do more harm for me than good. All of these different things. So I also want to put that out there, that this is not for a specific demographic of black people. This is black people across the spectrum. throughout the Western world, as well as in parts of Africa, as well as in parts in the Caribbean. I mean, in Jamaica, I was reading an article. There's still a significant part of the population in Jamaica, right? I have family members who have talked about there's still a significant part of the population who don't want to take the vaccine because of believing it's the Antichrist, because of believing all of these issues. This is not about whether that's right or wrong, but it's recognizing that there are people, this is real for people. As you've said, this is not a laughing matter for people. People are not ha-ha keen about it. People are saying, no, over my dead body that am I going to take this vaccine. And we have to recognize that a lot of this is as part of the consequences of perpetual lies and mistreatment of black people. Yes, even in the Caribbean, because people would say, but there's no white people in the Caribbean. You remember, the Caribbean had a long history of enslavement. Medical experimentation was a part of the enslavement experience of African people.
Absolutely.
And people don't think that left detrimental consequences, chronic mistrust of the government, including the medical system. When we understand all of the stuff that's happened in Canada when it comes to mistreatment, we talked about in the segment of Black maternal health, right? Black mothers who are mistrustful of physicians, not because they want to, but what else are you supposed to do when you've been wrong so many times? By natural consequence, you want to protect yourself, so you're going to be that much more hesitant. You're going to be that much more skeptical, right? So this is also what people have to understand. It's a serious consequence that ends up manifesting because of wrongs that have not even been acknowledged.
So then we could say, it's the fruit or the legacy of we could say, the perpetual injustice,
Very good.
inequality.
Yes.
And so people being aware of that, oftentimes experiencing that,
Yep.
and then seeing the present circumstances
Yes.
through those lenses.
Yeah.
And so so that's where now even the vaccine mandate was,
it was fought.
Was
fought with a heavy
of course,
hand, yeah.
vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah.
But again, in looking at the color of racism, again, we're still looking at that.
Yep.
There is, we could say, we saw that in the medical system. We saw that in even how, let's say New York, for example, there were mass graves. I don't know if you saw that, where let's say in some cases people of color felt that in the haste to get to more worthy patients, that oftentimes black people were cast aside, were not diagnosed, were not given the treatment or the chance to survive. So again, we're talking about
for the vaccine, you're saying?
Well, let's say, yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah,
for the
yeah,
vaccine
okay.
initially.
Yeah.
So, but also treatment, just the basic treatment.
Yeah. They were cast aside.
They
Yeah.
were cast aside.
Same thing was happening in Canada as well.
Same kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we also saw, let's say, abroad. There were
Yeah.
reports, let's say, in China.
Yes.
Think about this now. Again,
In Wuhan.
China. So now, remember, black African students.
Yep. Nigerian students, if I'm not mistaken.
Were really, I think,
They were thrown
either
out.
thrown out of the country.
Yeah. They were barred from restaurants. They were barred from going to places.
Barred from their rooms, hotel rooms, all those kind of things.
Yep.
For one thing only.
Yep.
Now think about that, for their color.
Yep.
And so again, that's all still a part of the color.
And I also want to add into that, how do we know that? Because there will be people who will say, no, had nothing to do with the color. I remember I was reading an article and it came from, and it was written from, it was written, I think, on ABC News or what, but it was like a legitimate source, right? Or some element of legitimate source that reported the incident in Wuhan, China. And how do we know, or how can we suspect that it was related to color? Because the Nigerian students weren't the only foreigners in China.
In China, exactly.
There was a white witness, for instance, a white man who was from, where was it? Was he from the U.S. or Australia? From a Western nation, but it was a white man who even himself said that he was told that, okay, well, we're going to have to check you because, if you're coming out of country, we're going to have to check you. So he went through the procedural process, but he was treated humanely. He wasn't tossed. He wasn't discriminated against, I guess you could say, severely. He was still treated humanely. He was still able to stay where he was at. There were just certain restrictions that were natural of the Chinese government. but the Nigerian students were not given that opportunity. There's other non-African peoples in China in that respective province that were also not as treated as harshly as Nigerian students. So this is why, by process of elimination, by ruling out those respective factors, we can come to the conclusion that the only difference couldn't have been status. It had to be ethnicity / color. And so I want people to know that, because we're not just doing this to make everything, quote unquote, using the race card. There's legitimate process of trying to come up with this conclusion, right? We are trying to deduce in a logical and rational manner so that people can understand how insidious this propaganda, this anti-African propaganda has been globally. We even see the same thing during the pandemic. I think it's a beautiful transition, even in talking about in the Ukraine. How on the earth, even in the Ukraine, you're being attacked by Russia and you still have time to discriminate against the African peoples who are at risk of being bombed same way as you. You have time to discriminate. You have time to berate us and call us all these racial epithets. Congolese refugees, Nigerian residents, all these people from throughout the continent. You have time to discriminate while we are just as much in danger as you are from being bombed. Now, I get you want to look out for your peoples, but shouldn't you be looking out for anybody who is in danger?
Well, if you break that down a little bit more specifically, for example, when Ukrainian refugees were trying to exit the country, let's say to Poland.
Yes.
I think you mean, let's say, going on the bus.
Yes,
let's say
going on the bus.
Buses,
Yes.
Then the bus driver or the people who are in charge of the bus would basically be saying, okay, you come on, white Ukrainians, come on. And we're talking about black Ukrainians were told to come off the bus. Those who are on the bus, some of them were told to come off the bus.
Some of whom were pregnant women.
Yeah, think about that.
Yes.
So I think what's important about, people say, well, why do you bring this up?
Yeah.
Well, the scourge of racism, if it's not identified, then you're not going to address it.
Very good.
But I think what it revealed, and you mentioned Wuhan, China, you mentioned Ukraine, even in a pandemic, even when people's lives
are at risk.
Yeah. Think about this now. Even when we're talking about death or a matter of life and death.
Yes.
The power of racism is still at work.
The disease of racism.
You see what I'm saying? So now,
I
think, in other words, what it reveals, though, David, as you know, is that it's so, we could say it's so intrinsic. It's so, it's so ingrained, we could say.
Yes.
That
we could.
What reveals it is that even when it's life and death, it's still at work. See that? So it's still killing people. It's still hurting people. It's still dividing people.
And devaluing people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or still showing the value of certain people.
Very good.
And so in some people's eyes.
So, in that same breath, and again, the irony of this idea of the vaccines when it comes to black people, because in Canada, because I really want to highlight, a lot of these atrocities have also taken place in Canada. This is why the Black Scientist Task Force came about in Ontario. There's been articles written about black people being disproportionately affected in places like Montreal, for instance, in neighborhoods like Low Burgundy, which is a very poor and economically disadvantaged neighborhood in Montreal. When they came with the vaccine, initially, again, because many black people were very hesitant, right, to take the vaccine. A lot of the government peoples were ambivalent about, well, do we give them the vaccine because you guys are more at risk of getting the disease, or do we hold back? It was almost as if either way they were at loss, right? And of course they would look at it and say, well, look, we're trying to help you. But it goes back to our earlier point. Well, this is what happens when you lie to a people for so long. We are at detriment either way we look at it, because either we are going to, take a vaccine because of all, let's say, the reports that say all the good, all the good things about the vaccines, but we feel like we're compromising our values. Yeah. But then we don't take the vaccine, and then we're at higher risk of health complications. So either way, we're at risk. And that cognitive dissonance that takes place, which for people who don't understand cognitive dissonance, it's when you have conflicting beliefs fighting against one another. Yeah. The pain that results as a result, that pain that results from that is so excruciating for Black people. And that is literally Black people's lives. Is we are at risk of cognitive dissonance because we know there's certain decisions we have to make that we think in our mind are probably for the good, but then we're conflicted because we're like, but you've lied to me so many times. How can I trust you? So why do I bring that up? Because when it came to whether or not Black people should be, let's say, the first group, but naturally speaking, if there's any other group, let's say that was at risk, we would of course say, from the outside looking in, well, of course that group should get it first because they're more at risk. Frontline workers getting the vaccine first makes sense, as you and I talked about. They're the most at risk. The elderly makes sense. They're the most at risk. Some thought, well, they're using the elderly for as guinea pigs for the vaccines. There's controversy around that. Sure, that's what people have said. But at the same time, if they're more at risk, we want to give them the antidote, right? The next group, the indigenous peoples, right? They said, well, they're the most at risk, unfortunately, because of the legacy of colonialism that has drastically affected indigenous people, where they are in Canada the most unhealthiest people, not by nature, but because of systemic neglect. They are the unhealthiest people in Canada in every single round. They have the lower life expectancy in comparison to any other group in Canada, right? So in understanding that, okay, by logic, it makes sense. So then next would be Black people. But this is where the controversy comes, even with indigenous peoples. Some indigenous peoples were a bit conflicted, but a lot of them decided to take it, right? Because similar to some Black people in the States, they said, well, for so long, they've restricted us, or matter of fact, they've prevented us from getting medical treatment. So some indigenous peoples, and I know because I lived amongst some of them when I used to live in the Yukon, we're like, no, we're going to take it. We don't trust the government. We don't trust them with anything, right? So we're going to take it just because we at least want our people to be healthy. I get it. But you have some other Black people who, again, were hesitant just because of our history of being medically experimented on. And how then when we were the first group, when we were one of the prioritized groups when it came to the vaccine, I seen some Black people who were still hesitant because they're like, well, why are they using us as guinea pigs again? It brings back trauma. Me, from a psychotherapist lens, I can see that is a trigger for trauma. It's a trigger for feeling like you're being re-victimized. Even if you're in a case where actually, technically, according to what the science says, receiving an antidote, technically, I'm not saying that's my point of view or not, but even in a situation like that, you feel like you're being re-victimized because it's coming from the people who you've had to miss, who have betrayed your trust for so many years. So all of that to say, it is such a complicated conversation that neither side is wrong. And I guess this is where some of my debates have come, if I'm being honest, with some of the, let's say, motives of the Black Scientist Task Force. And I'll say it, I've mentioned it in conversation with people. My issue isn't what their end goal is or what their objective is. Of course, to make sure Black people are not being neglected, to make sure that there is health equity. I get that. But my issue is when we're not taking the time to prioritize understanding and empathizing with Black people who are not going to take the vaccine.
I got you.
And empathizing with them and saying, okay, you know what? I can understand that decision, and not trying to guilt trip them.
I got you.
You see what I'm saying?
I hear you. But I think in my interaction with people who have helped, some people were connected to that Black doctors and scientists. What I appreciated about them and some of the virtual calls that I was in on was exactly the motivation you've communicated. Yeah. Which was is understanding history. I actually heard them refer specifically to history. They have. And actually communicating the concerns and trying to be, empathetic. Yes. To communicate, well, you know what, we understand it, but this is for your benefit. I think I kind of appreciated that for the most part.
And I do too. And I appreciate them saying this is for your benefit. But you have to understand also that there's still going to be some people that are going to say, well, how do you know that? Yeah.
And still be, in a sense, still be conciliatory, still be warm, still be an encourager to them. Does that make,
and that's it. And I guess there's, and I'm not going to speak for every single, member, because I've talked with some of them I do know. It's just in certain conversations that I've been privy to, there's almost this level of, I guess you could say, pretentiousness when it comes to especially educating some of the, I guess, more uneducated or less educated members of our community who are even more strong in their resistance. There's almost this, you give the explanation, well, I want you to be healthy. And they're saying, well, no. And they, yes, will come at it with these, I guess you could say in some ways, archaic ideologies of this being a part of the Antichrist and all of these things, that this is going to harm black people. I get it. And I call it archaic because people have said many things are part of the Antichrist. But it's almost when there's that resistance, they almost look down and say, oh my gosh, what's wrong with these black people?
I see.
This is what some of the things I've
saying.
heard. And for me, that's an issue.
I think so. I think as we wrap this up, I think
Yeah.
what you've communicated, and I think, and rightfully so, is regardless,
Yes.
show respect.
Thank you.
And I like that.
Show respect.
And as we close this, in this the colors of the pandemic, I should have said this at the beginning.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the pandemic, David, I'm sure you might be aware of this. I was listening to a conservative talk show.
Yeah.
And they were actually bringing this up. I think it was a medical doctor on, and of a certain community vaccinated right at the beginning, when Jane and Finch had not even 2%.
Yes. Yeah.
Talk about the colors.
But then you see it comes right back to what I was saying. Was that because black people were being hyper vigilant? Because you know, Jane and Finch is not solely a black
No, it's
neighborhood,
not.
but it's predominantly, right? Was it that black people were, and people of color in general, because there's people throughout the color spectrum, right? Filipinos, yes, Chinese, yes, Indians, etc. Was it that they're being hyper vigilant, and that's why there was such a low percentage?
No, the thing and that this person
For
brought
some-
out
okay.
is that they had the access very early. Key
Yes.
decision makers, influencers made sure
Yes.
the resources were brought into that community very early.
So then there's that, right? Yeah. So there's the access to resources. But then I've also concurrently heard and read stories, let's say in certain countries in Africa, where they, for one, are, yes, neglected of the resources of the vaccines, right? They're the least, they have been the ones who have not received the amount of vaccines that are necessary. Same thing with parts of the Caribbean. However, you have some countries who have rejected and said, we don't want them because we still don't believe in the virus.
I got you.
So then you see how both things are at play. And this is the challenge, because you have the under-resourced communities who are not even getting the medical treatments like the vaccines available to them. So yes, but at the same time, if you were to make available to some of them, there would still be the vaccine hesitancy to even get it. For example, Jamaican Canadian Association in Toronto. They had access to it. They had to go on a campaign to say, we have gotten these vaccines.
Yeah.
Come and take them. And you still have some black people like, are you crazy? You mad? Right? I'm not taking it. Right?
Gotcha.
So this is why there's two things at play as to what is leading to
That's
this
well said.
under-resource, but also hypervigilance.
Excellent. Very good. Well, trust you enjoyed today's episode of Rebuilding the Black Family, speaking about the colors of the pandemic. And thanks again for joining us. And remember, it is the truth that makes you free. Join us again on another episode of Rebuilding the Black Family. See you next time.